January 26, 1943 began like many other days of war patrol in the Western Pacific, yet it would end etched permanently into naval history. At a point just north of New Guinea, in waters marked only by latitude and longitude, Lieutenant George Grider hesitated briefly before continuing his handwritten log. What he recorded in those moments would later be read not simply as a report, but as testimony to a moral rupture brought on by total war. The commanding officer had issued an order to engage small boats in the water. For men trained in the traditions of submarine service, the command was deeply unsettling. Submariners were prepared to stalk ships, fire torpedoes, and disappear beneath the surface, not to aim weapons at survivors drifting helplessly at sea. Through the periscope, the submarine's captain, Commander Dudley Walker "Mush" Morton, observed a scene that clashed violently with everything he had learned as a young officer. Dozens of lifeboats and small powered launches rose and fell on the warm swells, crowded with men who had escaped the sinking transport the submarine had just destroyed. In earlier conflicts, and certainly in peacetime conventions, the next step would have been restraint. The laws and customs of the sea were unambiguous. Survivors were not targets. But the Pacific War was rewriting those rules in real time. These waters were not clearly controlled by either side, and Morton believed hesitation carried its own deadly consequences. As the USS Wahoo lay surfaced to recharge its batteries following the sinking of the 5,447-ton Japanese transport Buyo Maru, a decision was made that would reverberate far beyond that single patrol. Unbeknownst to the American crew, nearly 200 of the men struggling in those boats were Indian prisoners of war. Captured by Japanese forces after the fall of Singapore, they were being transported to forced labor camps. Their presence was invisible through the lens of a periscope, and in that invisibility lay the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, where human lives could vanish into abstractions of risk, survival, and mission success. Aboard the Wahoo, 79 sailors stood at their assigned stations. They had trained relentlessly for torpedo attacks against enemy shipping, not for what was about to follow. Yet, machine guns were manned, and fire was directed across the water. In that moment, submarine warfare crossed a psychological threshold, one shaped as much by fear and aggression as by strategy. The man at the center of this transformation had been born far from any ocean. Dudley Walker Morton entered the world on July 17, 1907 in Owensboro, Kentucky, a river town separated by 1,000 miles from saltwater. His father, a modest local businessman, could not have foreseen that his son would one day command one of the most lethal naval platforms ever devised. Morton arrived at the United States Naval Academy in the summer of 1926, part of a cohort that would suffer extraordinary losses in the coming global conflict. Physically imposing at 6 feet tall, with oversized hands and a pronounced jaw that earned him the nickname Mushmouth, he excelled in athletics, particularly wrestling and football. Yet it was in the classroom, specifically in courses on undersea warfare, that instructors detected his distinctive mindset. While many midshipmen focused on evasion and reconnaissance, Morton gravitated toward offensive theory. He analyzed firing solutions, angles of approach, and the mechanics of overwhelming an enemy before that enemy could react. This fixation on attack over caution would define his career. After his commissioning in 1930, Morton's early service took place aboard surface ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and the heavy cruiser USS Chicago. The routines of surface warfare, however, failed to satisfy him. He sought a form of combat that rewarded initiative and boldness. That search led him in 1933 to submarine duty at New London, Connecticut, a decision that placed him among officers drawn to the most demanding and isolated branch of the Navy. At submarine school, Morton's instructors again noted his departure from established norms. Doctrine at the time emphasized submarines as cautious observers and opportunistic hunters. Morton argued instead for relentless pressure on the enemy. One senior officer remarked in an evaluation that Morton possessed an uncommon aggressiveness for a submariner, an asset in war provided it could be restrained by sound judgment. Throughout the late 1930s, Morton gained experience across the Pacific. He served with the Asiatic Fleet, operated from the tender USS Canopus, and patrolled aboard the submarine S-37 in waters around the Philippines. These assignments familiarized him with regions that would later become major battlegrounds. His return journey to the United States in 1937 took him through Siberia and Europe, exposing him firsthand to the accelerating militarization of the world. Back in America, Morton studied the Navy's new generation of fleet submarines at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. These vessels were larger, faster, and far more heavily armed than their predecessors, true capital ships of undersea warfare. By 1939, serving as executive officer aboard the destroyer USS Fairfax, Morton expanded his understanding of surface combat, lessons he would later adapt in unconventional ways beneath the waves. When he assumed command of the submarine R-5 in August 1940, his philosophy was already firmly established. He placed a sign in the control room that summarized his outlook with blunt clarity: "We will take the fight to the enemy." It was not a slogan born of theory, but a statement of intent, one that would shape his actions and leave a lasting, controversial imprint on the history of naval warfare. December 7, 1941, marked a fundamental rupture in American naval history. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor forced the United States Navy to abandon long-standing assumptions almost overnight. Within hours of the bombing, Admiral Harold R. Stark, serving as Chief of Naval Operations, issued a brief but unprecedented directive. American forces were to conduct unrestricted submarine and air warfare against Japan. With that single order, decades of U.S. naval tradition and established international maritime law were effectively set aside. Less than a year later, on October 15, 1942, Dudley "Mush" Morton was promoted to lieutenant commander. At the time, he was stationed at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, supervising the construction and overhaul of new submarines. The Navy, however, was facing a critical problem. Submarine performance in the Pacific had been deeply disappointing during the first year of the war. Out of 363 patrols conducted in 1942, a striking number returned without firing a single torpedo. Many commanding officers, shaped by pre-war doctrine, hesitated to close with the enemy or disengaged at the first sign of danger. Naval leadership concluded that the submarine force needed commanders willing to accept greater risk. Morton, known for his aggressive instincts, soon received orders sending him to Pearl Harbor as a prospective commanding officer. His first assignment was a temporary, largely symbolic command of USS Dolphin while the aging submarine underwent repairs. The vessel, slow and obsolete, offered little opportunity for the kind of warfare Morton envisioned. That opportunity arrived when Lieutenant Commander Marvin Kennedy, commanding officer of USS Wahoo, was judged to have performed inadequately during his second patrol. Kennedy's caution, while doctrinally sound, no longer aligned with the Navy's evolving expectations. Senior officers decided that Wahoo required new leadership. From early November until late December 1942, Morton sailed aboard Wahoo as an observer, officially designated as the prospective commanding officer. During this period, he carefully studied Kennedy's methods. Attacks were conducted from extreme range, followed by immediate deep dives after firing. To Morton, these tactics reflected fear rather than calculation. Privately, he expressed his frustration to fellow officer Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, remarking that the submarine force was fighting as if it were more concerned with preserving paint than destroying the enemy. On December 31, 1942, while docked in Brisbane, Australia, command of USS Wahoo formally passed to Morton. His first move was unconventional. He assembled the crew not on the bridge or in the wardroom, but in the forward torpedo room. Speaking plainly and without ceremony, he told them that the submarine itself was expendable. Their responsibility, he emphasized, was to sink enemy ships. Caution would still exist, but retreat would no longer be the default response. Even Japanese destroyers, long regarded as untouchable threats, were now legitimate targets. The message unsettled many of the sailors. Submarines had always been treated as rare and precious assets. Morton's philosophy challenged that mindset entirely. To reinforce his intent, he displayed hand-painted placards bearing the phrase, "Shoot the rising sun," written in bold red letters, and ordered them posted throughout the boat. A profound shift in Wahoo's identity had begun. Morton's influence quickly reshaped both tactics and culture aboard the submarine. During combat, instead of personally controlling the periscope as tradition dictated, he delegated attack execution to his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, positioned in the conning tower. This arrangement demanded complete trust. It allowed Morton to focus on synthesizing sonar data, target motion analysis, torpedo solutions, and evolving tactical conditions in real time. Engineering officer George Grider later noted that few commanders possessed the confidence required to operate this way, but the result was faster, more decisive action. Equally important was Morton's approach to leadership. He dismantled the rigid hierarchy common aboard submarines of the era. He made a point of learning every sailor's name, background, and personal concerns. Seaman Forrest Sterling, who served as a lookout, later recalled that Morton routinely moved through the boat at all hours, speaking casually with the crew and asking about their families. This personal engagement fostered an intense sense of loyalty and pride. In preparation for combat, Morton instituted relentless training. During the refit period in Brisbane, the crew rehearsed emergency surface maneuvers and battle stations repeatedly until they could fully man all weapons in under 30 seconds. He required sailors to cross-train beyond their specialties. Torpedo men learned radar operations, electricians practiced torpedo handling. Morton believed that redundancy and adaptability would determine survival once combat began. On January 16, 1943, USS Wahoo departed Brisbane on her third war patrol. The assigned patrol area was Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea, a heavily defended Japanese logistics hub. Previous American submarines had treated the harbor with caution, remaining at distance to collect intelligence rather than engage. The shallow waters, confined approaches, and enemy presence made direct action extremely risky. Morton rejected that caution outright. On January 24th, he navigated Wahoo directly into the harbor itself, threading through waters so shallow that the keel nearly scraped the seabed. At approximately 0800 hours, he observed a Japanese destroyer moored alongside several submarines. Instead of withdrawing, Morton ordered an immediate attack. 3 torpedoes were fired at the stationary target, but all failed to hit. The destroyer responded at once, getting underway and accelerating straight toward Wahoo. Under established doctrine, this was the moment for an emergency dive and evasive maneuvering. Morton refused. He held position, maintaining a head-on aspect as the enemy closed the distance. When asked for the range, O'Kane reported 1,200 yards and rapidly decreasing. Through the periscope, the destroyer's bow wave became unmistakable. At 800 yards, Morton gave the order. 5 torpedoes were launched. One struck the destroyer amidships, detonating with devastating force and snapping the vessel apart. The explosion confirmed what Morton had believed from the beginning. Aggressive action, executed with precision and confidence, could overturn every assumption that had previously governed submarine warfare in the Pacific. Viewed through the periscope, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane witnessed a scene of sudden chaos. Japanese sailors were hurled into the air as explosions tore across the destroyer's deck. More than 100 men had been assigned as lookouts, spread across every accessible section of the ship's upper works, yet the attack overwhelmed them completely. Within a matter of minutes, the destroyer was gone beneath the surface. The engagement confirmed what Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton had come to believe. Boldness, when applied decisively, could defeat even a well-prepared anti-submarine defense. Only 2 days later, on January 26th, the submarine Wahoo detected another opportunity. Its radar screen revealed a sizable enemy convoy operating northeast of New Guinea. Instead of remaining submerged, Morton made a decision that defied established doctrine. He brought Wahoo to the surface in full daylight and used the submarine's superior speed on the surface to maneuver into an ideal firing position. Conventional wisdom dictated that submarines should never expose themselves during daylight hours in hostile waters. Morton, however, had learned through experience that Japanese lookouts were trained almost exclusively to search for periscopes. Distant surface vessels often escaped their attention. The convoy consisted of 6 transports accompanied by destroyer escorts. Throughout the morning, Morton shadowed the formation, carefully adjusting Wahoo's course until the submarine was perfectly aligned for an attack. At 11:30 a.m., he ordered the firing of 4 torpedoes at what appeared to be the largest ship in the group. From the periscope, O'Kane observed the torpedoes strike their target. The vessel, later identified as the 5,447-ton transport Wahoo Maru, convulsed under the impact, began to tilt, and slowly settled stern first into the sea. What followed would become one of the most debated episodes in U.S. naval history. After surfacing to recharge batteries depleted during the high-speed pursuit, Morton surveyed the aftermath through binoculars. He counted roughly 20 small boats leaving the stricken transport. They were densely packed, hundreds, possibly thousands of Japanese troops making for the nearby coast of New Guinea, only a short distance away. Morton summoned his officers to the conning tower. He framed the dilemma bluntly. If those soldiers reached land, American and Australian forces would soon face them in combat. Lieutenant Dick Kane was the first to object, pointing out that international law forbade attacks on survivors of a shipwreck. Morton replied that international law had already been compromised by the realities of the Pacific War, particularly since the adoption of unrestricted submarine warfare following Pearl Harbor. In his view, these men were not helpless castaways, but active enemy combatants using boats as improvised landing craft. Lieutenant George Grider, clearly troubled, raised another concern. It was impossible to know with certainty who was in the boats. There could be civilian crewmen or even prisoners among them. Morton listened, but his resolve did not waver. He argued that every soldier who made it ashore would soon contribute to Allied casualties. Compared to the strategic bombing of cities, he believed his decision was both limited and militarily justified. Shortly after noon, Morton issued the command that would define his legacy. The submarine would fight on the surface. Crewmen rushed to their assigned stations. The 4-inch deck gun was readied, along with twin 20mm cannons and several machine guns. Below decks, lookout yeoman Forrest Sterling watched with growing unease. Years later, he would recall seeing a man in one of the boats waving what appeared to be a white cloth, possibly an attempt to signal surrender. Morton ordered a single warning round fired into the largest boat. The response was immediate and decisive. Small arms fire erupted from the boats and struck Wahoo's hull. Bullets clanged against the conning tower, some landing dangerously close to where Morton stood. In his mind, this return fire eliminated any remaining ambiguity. What might have been considered an attack on survivors had now become an active engagement. He gave the order to open fire. For the next half hour to 45 minutes, Wahoo steamed slowly along the scattered line of boats. The deck gun destroyed the larger craft one by one, while machine guns raked the smaller vessels. Amid the noise and smoke, moments of grim clarity stood out. One swimmer approached the submarine, seemingly attempting to climb aboard. When a gunner asked whether the man should be taken prisoner, Morton reportedly rejected the idea outright. From his vantage point, Sterling later described the aftermath in stark terms. bodies floating motionless, wrecked boats drifting apart, and the sea discolored by blood. Some men attempted to swim away, others clung desperately to debris. The gunfire did not discriminate between resistance and surrender. Deep inside the submarine, George Grider felt each discharge of the deck gun reverberate through the hull. He could hear the sustained gunfire, but could not see its effects. In his memoir, written many years later, Grider would wrestle with the contradiction between the commander he respected for his brilliance and courage and the officer who had ordered this action. The Wahoo Maru incident, as it came to be known, remains a stark illustration of the moral and legal ambiguities faced by those fighting a total war at sea. Mush was neither a man driven by cruelty nor someone who took pleasure in suffering. He was, above all else, a combat officer shaped by a brutal conflict, convinced that victory justified extreme decisions. In his mind, the Pacific War was not governed by restraint, but by survival and momentum. When the engagement finally ended, silence returned to the sea, broken only by drifting wreckage. None of the transport vessels had survived. The surrounding waters were thick with fuel oil, debris, and the bodies of hundreds of men who had never reached shore. With the area secured, Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton instructed USS Wahoo to withdraw and continue hunting the remnants of the enemy convoy. Later, in his official patrol summary, Morton described the outcome in a cold, impersonal manner, recording that all small craft had been destroyed and estimating enemy losses at between 1,500 and 6,000 personnel. This figure would stand unchallenged until after the war, when investigations revealed a far lower but no less tragic number: 282 fatalities in total, among them 195 Indian prisoners of war. When Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor on February 7, 1943, word of the patrol's events spread rapidly throughout the submarine base. The boat arrived in celebratory fashion. A broom was fixed to the periscope supports, the traditional signal of a mission completed without leaving targets behind. Japanese flags were painted along the conning tower, marking confirmed sinkings. Outwardly, the patrol was treated as a success. Privately, it unsettled the submarine community. In workshops, mess halls, and the officers' club, conversations dropped to whispers when the subject of the lifeboat shootings arose. Many understood the pressure Morton had faced. Others feared the precedent his actions might set. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet submarines, recognized the sensitivity of the situation immediately. Morton's conduct risked violating established international law and could invite severe retaliation if American submariners were captured in the future. At the same time, Morton was widely regarded as the Navy's most effective submarine commander, an innovator who had transformed an overly cautious force into an aggressive and lethal weapon. Lockwood chose a carefully balanced response. Publicly, he commended Morton's patrol and its results. Behind closed doors, however, he ensured that no written doctrine or verbal guidance would ever suggest approval of attacks on survivors. The message was deliberately ambiguous: recognition without endorsement. Captain John "Babe" Brown, Lockwood's operations officer, was tasked with formally debriefing Morton. Over multiple interviews, Brown pressed him about the decision to fire on lifeboats. According to later declassified documents, Morton expressed no regret. He argued that the men in the water were enemy troops attempting to regroup and reach land, and therefore remained legitimate targets. Brown later summarized Morton's outlook succinctly, noting that the commander viewed the conflict as an all-encompassing war, one in which no meaningful distinction existed between soldiers on ships, on land, or temporarily adrift at sea. Reaction among fellow submarine commanders was divided. Lawson Red Ramage, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, admitted that while he believed the action crossed a moral line, he could understand Morton's reasoning under the circumstances. This was not, Ramage remarked, a gentleman's contest governed by formal rules. Eugene Lucky Flucky, another future Medal of Honor recipient, disagreed entirely. For him, the act violated a fundamental American principle. No matter how ruthless the enemy, he argued, firing on defenseless men in the water was unacceptable. Perhaps the strongest defense of Morton came from Wahoo's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane. Long after the war, until his death in 1994, O'Kane consistently stood by his former captain. In interviews, he maintained that the troops in the boats were armed, moving toward shore, and had opened fire first. Morton's decision, O'Kane insisted, was a calculated effort to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the Guinea. It was grim, but, in his view, unavoidable. The full scope of the tragedy remained hidden until years later. Post-war investigations revealed the true nature of Wahoo Maru's passenger list. Aboard the ship were 1,126 individuals. 336 Japanese soldiers from the 26th Field Ordnance Depot and 760 Indian prisoners of war belonging to the 2nd Battalion of the 16th Punjab Regiment. These Indian soldiers had been captured during the fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in British military history. After capture, they were pressured to join the Japanese-backed Indian National Army and fight against British forces. Those who refused were sentenced to forced labor in New Guinea. The Japanese transported them under appalling conditions. They were confined in the cargo holds of Wahoo Maru, which bore no markings identifying it as a prisoner transport, an explicit violation of the Geneva Convention. One of the few Indian survivors, Private Ravi Singh, later testified to British investigators in 1946. When the torpedo struck, he recalled, the Japanese guards abandoned the prisoners, leaving them locked below deck. The Indians forced their way out on their own. Once in the lifeboats, they attempted to signal the submarine, believing rescue might be possible. One man waved a white undershirt in desperation. The guards ordered them to stop. According to Singh, they said the Americans would kill everyone regardless, and tragically, that warning proved accurate. During the evacuation, Japanese personnel prioritized their own soldiers. Indian prisoners who tried to board boats were frequently beaten back or thrown into the sea. When Wahoo opened fire, the prisoners found themselves caught between their captors and what they believed might have been their liberators. Of the 195 Indian prisoners who died that day, most were killed not by the torpedo that sank their transport, but by gunfire from the submarine. This conclusion was confirmed in 1947 by Lieutenant Colonel James Wilkinson, who led the British inquiry into the incident. January 26, 1943 would come to represent one of the most morally complex episodes of the U.S. submarine campaign, an event shaped by secrecy, misinformation, and the unforgiving logic of total war. The deaths of the Indian prisoners aboard the Japanese transport were not the result of deliberate targeting by American forces, but rather the tragic intersection of two wartime realities: Japan's systematic failure to identify vessels carrying prisoners of war, and the aggressive submarine campaign conducted by the United States Navy in the Pacific. When USS Wahoo attacked the ship, its commander, Dudley "Mush" Morton, had no practical means of knowing that Allied captives were among those on board. By 1943, the legal framework governing naval warfare, particularly submarine operations, was deeply fractured. On paper, several international agreements still existed, but in practice they conflicted with each other and were routinely ignored. Article 22 of the 1936 London Naval Treaty required submarines to follow the same rules as surface warships when engaging merchant vessels. It explicitly stated that crews and passengers had to be placed in safety before a ship could be sunk, and clarified that lifeboats alone did not qualify as safe unless land or rescue vessels were immediately accessible. Earlier conventions reinforced this humanitarian principle. The 1907 Hague Convention X, for example, obligated belligerents to safeguard shipwrecked individuals from abuse, violence, and theft, regardless of nationality. Yet these legal ideals quickly eroded once full-scale war began in the Pacific. From the opening phase of hostilities, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. This directive removed the requirement for warning or rescue and effectively placed American submarine commanders in permanent violation of existing international maritime law. Each unannounced sinking of a merchant ship technically breached treaty obligations. Japan, for its part, had never ratified the 1936 London Protocol and formally declared its own unrestricted submarine policy, rejecting the treaty system outright. In reality, both sides discarded legal restraint in favor of operational effectiveness. Decades later, legal scholars would attempt to untangle these contradictions. Professor James Whitman of Yale Law School, writing on the subject, concluded that by the midpoint of the war, the Pacific theater operated outside any coherent legal order. According to his analysis, maritime law had collapsed under the weight of total war, replaced by an informal consensus that military necessity overruled humanitarian regulation. Morton's conduct, while severe, unfolded within what Whitman described as a de facto legal void rather than a clearly governed system. There was, moreover, an uncomfortable historical precedent for violence against survivors at sea. German U-boat crews had, on rare but infamous occasions, attacked shipwrecked sailors. The most notorious example occurred in March 1944 when U-852 machine-gunned survivors of the Greek freighter Pallas. Its commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Wilhelm Eck, was later tried and executed for war crimes. At the same time, accountability was inconsistent. Admiral Karl Donitz, who issued the Laconia Order prohibiting German submarines from rescuing survivors, avoided conviction at Nuremberg. One key factor was Admiral Nimitz's testimony that American submarines had operated under similar restrictions in the Pacific, effectively normalizing the practice of non-rescue. Morton's case, however, stood apart in an important way. Unlike commanders who simply withdrew after sinking a vessel, he ordered direct attacks on survivors in the water. This distinction, active violence versus abandonment, would later become central to moral and legal evaluations of the incident. The official U.S. Navy narrative sought to minimize attention to the event. Captain Jasper Holmes, author of The Authoritative History of American Submarine Operations in the Pacific, mentioned only that Wahoo destroyed lifeboats, offering no detail regarding the circumstances or intent behind the action. The omission was deliberate, reflecting an institutional desire to avoid scrutiny rather than a lack of information. The Japanese response, though never openly tied to this specific episode, was both rapid and severe. Internal directives soon circulated within the Imperial Japanese Navy, warning that American submarines showed no mercy and should be treated accordingly. This shift in attitude contributed to a sharp escalation in brutality. Among those who embodied this response was Commander Tetsunosuke Aryuzumi of submarine I-8, who would later become infamous for ordering atrocities against Allied survivors at sea. In this way, a single unacknowledged encounter rippled outward, shaping behavior on both sides and illustrating how, in the Pacific War, the collapse of law, secrecy, and retaliation fed into one another with devastating consequences. In late March of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-8 intercepted and sank the Dutch merchant vessel Chiselak. What followed was not a conventional act of war, but a calculated atrocity. The submarine's commander, Tatsunosuke Aryuzumi, ordered the surviving crew and passengers, nearly 100 men, transferred onto the deck of the submarine. Once there, they were killed one by one using edged weapons and improvised tools such as hammers and wrenches. Members of the crew reportedly treated the event as spectacle rather than duty, recording the killings and reacting with laughter. Only 5 men escaped death by pretending to be lifeless and later slipping into the sea. This incident marked not an aberration but an escalation that intensified over the course of 1944. Other Japanese submarines soon followed a similar pattern. In February of that year, submarine I-37 attacked survivors from the British merchant ship Ascot, raking the water with machine gun fire. 1 month later, I-26 deliberately smashed into lifeboats after sinking the American Liberty ship Richard Hovey, ensuring that few could escape. Japanese records later justified these acts by pointing to American submarine behavior, repeatedly citing the so-called Wahoo lifeboat incident as evidence that the enemy had abandoned restraint first. For American submariners, capture by Japanese forces was particularly perilous. Unlike pilots shot down over land or sailors taken from surface vessels, submarine crewmen were often viewed as criminals rather than prisoners of war. Many were executed soon after capture. Of the 374 U.S. submariners known to have fallen into Japanese hands during the conflict, only 168 lived to see liberation. The mortality rate, nearly 1 in 2, was among the highest for any branch of the American armed forces.
Interrogations reflected this hostility. Japanese officers frequently questioned captured submariners about attacks on shipwreck survivors. Any acknowledgement, real or coerced, was later used to rationalize brutal treatment, including torture and execution. Violence fed on violence, and retaliation became self-perpetuating. This downward spiral reached its most tragic expression in the use of so-called hell ships. These were unmarked Japanese transports packed with Allied prisoners of war, carried in appalling conditions, without ventilation, medical care, or identification. By the end of the war, at least 134 such vessels had transported more than 126,000 prisoners. Because the ships bore no markings and often traveled with normal cargo convoys, American submarines attacked them without knowing who was aboard. 19 hell ships were sunk by U.S. submarines, resulting in the deaths of roughly 21,000 Allied prisoners. The sinking of Buyo Maru was only the most infamous of these disasters. Similar tragedies occurred repeatedly, each compounding the moral and human cost of the Pacific War. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, captain of USS Wahoo, never publicly expressed regret for the Buyo Maru incident. If anything, his subsequent patrols suggested an increasing aggressiveness. On Wahoo's 4th war patrol in the Yellow Sea, Morton pushed his submarine into waters so shallow that Japanese naval planners believed submarines could not operate there at all. In those supposedly safe zones, Wahoo destroyed 9 enemy vessels. The following patrol was even bolder. Morton took Wahoo into the Sea of Japan itself, waters often described as the Emperor's private lake, encircled by the Japanese home islands and heavily defended. No American submarine had entered these seas and returned. Morton not only survived the penetration, but sank 4 ships before slipping back through the mined La Perouse Strait. His exploits elevated him to near-legendary status. American newspapers portrayed him as a lone fleet unto himself. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented Morton with the Army Distinguished Service Cross, yet those who knew him well sensed a change. When George Grider, Wahoo's former executive officer, met Morton briefly in August 1933, he noticed a man who appeared exhausted and inwardly burdened. The captain's once effortless humor surfaced less often. When Grider cautiously raised the subject of the lifeboat shootings, Morton deflected the question. "We do what we have to do," was all he would offer. In September 1943, Morton departed on Wahoo's 7th patrol, again bound for the Sea of Japan. Before leaving port, he spoke privately with Dick O'Kane, now a submarine commander in his own right.
Morton told him that if Wahoo failed to return, O'Kane should know he had been the finest executive officer Morton had ever served with. It was a quiet farewell. On October 11, 1943, Japanese naval logs recorded an encounter in the La Perouse Strait. Aircraft attacked what was believed to be an American submarine. Observers reported a violent explosion, followed by oil spreading across the surface and scattered debris. USS Wahoo and her entire crew of 79 men vanished. Morton was 36 years old. The U.S. Navy's handling of Wahoo's loss was notable as much for its silences as for its statements. Admiral Charles Lockwood recommended Morton for a posthumous Medal of Honor, praising his innovative tactics and extraordinary boldness. The nomination was rejected without explanation and reduced to a fourth Navy Cross. Historians later agreed that the decision was almost certainly influenced by the Buyo Maru affair. For decades, the full story remained hidden. Official patrol reports released to the public merely stated that Wahoo had destroyed lifeboats carrying enemy soldiers. Critical details, the length of the engagement, the nature of the weapons used, and the number of casualties were sealed in classified archives. When George Grider published his memoir, Warfish, in 1958, Navy censors required him to condense the incident into a few carefully worded, ambiguous passages. This secrecy served several purposes. It shielded Morton's family from public scrutiny, denied Japanese propagandists a powerful narrative, and spared the U.S. Navy from confronting troubling questions about conduct in what was often remembered as a morally unambiguous war. Official memory favored Morton as a brilliant tactician and daring commander, not as a figure whose actions blurred ethical boundaries. Only in 1995, long after most participants were dead, did the complete record come to light. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, historians gained access to unedited patrol logs, crew testimony, and post-war investigative files. The resulting picture was more complex and more disturbing, a portrait of submarine warfare in the Pacific, where innovation, fear, vengeance, and moral compromise became inseparably intertwined.
The disclosure of the incident reignited a long-standing controversy over the ethics of submarine warfare and the moral costs imposed by total war. At the center of this debate stands Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton and the actions taken by USS Wahoo in January 1943. An episode that continues to unsettle historians and moral philosophers more than 80 years later. Dr. Clay Blair, Jr., whose monumental work, Silent Victory, The U.S. Submarine War Against Japan, remains the definitive study of the Pacific Undersea Campaign, wrestled openly with how to incorporate the event into his narrative. Rather than isolating the incident as an anomaly or passing judgment on Morton, Blair placed it among numerous examples illustrating how prolonged industrial warfare erodes moral boundaries. In his assessment, war itself acts as a corrosive force. As Blair famously observed, conflict reshapes ordinary individuals into agents of lethal violence, and in Morton's case, that transformation was especially pronounced. Scholars remain deeply divided. Those inclined to defend Morton emphasize the operational context. The soldiers aboard the Japanese transport were armed and returned fire. They were en route to reinforce enemy garrisons actively resisting Allied forces. Moreover, the Pacific theater had already descended into a form of warfare in which conventional restraints, legal, cultural, and humanitarian, had largely collapsed on both sides. This perspective echoes themes explored by political philosopher Michael Walzer in Just and Unjust Wars, where he confronts the moral ambiguities of survival under conditions of extreme threat.
Though Walzer does not address the Morton episode directly, his broader question looms over it. When adversaries abandon restraint entirely, to what extent can retaliation be morally evaluated by peacetime standards? The submarine campaign against Japan presents perhaps the most severe challenge to military ethics. It unfolded as a racialized total war, fueled by propaganda that dehumanized the enemy and framed annihilation as necessity. Within this environment, ethical lines blurred rapidly. Critics, however, maintain that no strategic justification can excuse the deliberate targeting of defenseless survivors. They argue that certain moral principles, particularly the protection of those no longer capable of resistance, exist beyond treaties or battlefield expedients. The later discovery that Indian prisoners of war were among those attacked, even if unknown to Morton at the time, underscores the peril inherent in abandoning the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Once that boundary dissolves, they contend, atrocities cease to be exceptional and become inevitable. Military psychologist Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman has cited the Wahoo incident as a textbook case of moral injury, acts committed during war that violate a soldier's deeply held ethical beliefs. Grossman points to Morton's conduct following the event, marked by heightened aggression alongside signs of emotional withdrawal, as evidence that crossing this moral threshold carried lasting psychological consequences. Within the U.S. submarine force itself, the episode remains a subject of unresolved debate. At the Navy's submarine school, the incident is presented not as a lesson with a prescribed conclusion, but as a case study in ethical tension. Instructors emphasize that no definitive moral verdict exists. Instead, each commander must confront such dilemmas personally, balancing mission imperatives against humanitarian responsibility. The full human scope of the events of January 26, 1943 only became clear through meticulous post-war investigation. In 1962, Japanese survivor Petty Officer Hiroaki Yamada provided a harrowing account after enduring 6 hours adrift amid wreckage. He recalled the submarine maneuvering deliberately around the survivors, its deck guns manned and trained upon them. Some Japanese soldiers fired rifles from the water, a futile act, he later admitted. The submarine's heavier guns destroyed lifeboats, and machine gun fire followed men as they leapt into the sea. The testimonies of Indian prisoners revealed an even more devastating dimension. Lance Corporal Ajit Khan, one of 565 Indians who survived captivity, described the crushing moment of betrayal they felt. British officers in Singapore, he recalled, had assured them that American forces treated prisoners humanely. When the shooting began, disbelief paralyzed many. Some stood upright, hands raised, convinced rescue had arrived. They were killed where they stood. Japanese administrative records, preserved for potential propaganda use should the Indians later be persuaded to join the Japanese cause, unexpectedly restored individual identities to the victims. Among them was Havildar Bhagat Ram, aged 28, a father of 3 from Punjab. Sepoy Mohan Lal, only 19, had enlisted to escape grinding poverty. Naik Singh, 35, had previously been recognized for courage during the Malayan campaign. On the Japanese side, the 366 soldiers of the 26th Field Ordnance Depot were largely young conscripts with an average age of just 22. Their commanding officer, Major Yoshiro Tanaka, left behind a widow and 2 children. Witnesses last saw him attempting to impose order among the lifeboats before the Wahoo opened fire. His remains were never recovered. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Families on both sides endured years of uncertainty. Indian prisoners were officially listed as missing, presumed dead, with no explanation offered. Parents, spouses, and children waited for answers that never arrived. In this silence, the true cost of the incident lingered.
not merely in strategic assessments or ethical debates, but in lives permanently fractured by a single moment at sea. The British government did not formally inform the families of the Indian soldiers until 1947, and even then, the disclosure was deliberately sparse. Officials feared that a fuller explanation might ignite diplomatic tension at a moment when India and Pakistan had only just emerged as independent states. What little information was shared was carefully worded, prioritizing political stability over transparency. Controversy surrounding Dudley "Mush" Morton has never faded. Yet his influence on the course of the Pacific Naval War is undeniable. Prior to his rise, American submarines in the Pacific were cautious to the point of ineffectiveness. On average, a patrol resulted in the destruction of only half a ship. Morton challenged that culture outright. Through his aggressive doctrine and willingness to take extraordinary risks, he demonstrated that submarines could do far more than merely observe and evade. After his example spread, the average number of enemy vessels sunk per patrol tripled. His impact was not confined to statistics alone. Commanders who had once avoided confrontation began actively seeking it. Submarine warfare, previously defined by restraint and hesitation, evolved into an offensive campaign. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. Submarine Force in the Pacific, recorded in his classified wartime journal that Morton had fundamentally altered the mindset of his captains. According to Lockwood, Morton's methods, while ethically and tactically debatable, proved that American submarines could dominate rather than hide. The fleet was no longer reacting to enemy destroyers, it was hunting them. The numerical evidence reinforced this shift. In 1942, American submarines accounted for roughly 180 Japanese ships sunk. By 1943, after Morton's approach had taken root, that number climbed to 335. A year later, the situation became catastrophic for Japan. Submarines were destroying merchant shipping faster than Japanese shipyards could replace it. A nation whose survival depended on imported fuel, food, and raw materials found itself slowly suffocated. This campaign was carried out by approximately 250 U.S. submarines operating primarily from Pearl Harbor and Australian bases. Many of the tactical practices that enabled this success traced directly back to Morton. One such change was the decision to assign executive officers to operate the periscope during attacks, allowing captains to focus entirely on command decisions. This practice became standard throughout the fleet. Even more radical was the normalization of daylight surface attacks, maneuvers once considered reckless if not suicidal. Under Morton's influence, they became routine. Perhaps his most lasting contribution was philosophical rather than technical. Morton insisted that submarines should be viewed as primary offensive weapons, not auxiliary scouts. This belief reshaped training, planning, and execution across the submarine force. Commander Lawson "Red" Ramage later embodied this doctrine during a daring surface assault that earned him the Medal of Honor. Ramage openly credited Morton's example, recalling the image of Morton standing exposed on the bridge, unshaken as enemy destroyers closed in. If Morton could face such danger without hesitation, Ramage believed, then so could he. During that single night action, Ramage destroyed 5 enemy ships, equaling Morton's audacity, though not the moral weight of his most infamous actions. Decades later, in October 2006, a Russian deep-sea expedition located the wreck of the USS Wahoo in La Perouse Strait, resting 213 feet below the surface. The submarine had been torn into 3 major sections, indicating a massive internal explosion. The forward section, which housed the torpedo room where Morton once addressed his crew, remained largely intact. Within the wreck lay the remains of 79 American sailors. The discovery reignited global attention on Morton's career, particularly the Wahoo Maru incident. Japanese scholars, granted access to previously sealed wartime archives, uncovered unsettling material. Documents suggested that the Imperial Japanese Navy had deliberately singled out Wahoo for elimination. The campaign was reportedly given a specific code name, an act of retribution tied directly to Wahoo Maru. Intercepted communications indicate the Japanese commanders in October 1943 were not merely searching for an enemy submarine, but for that submarine. This revelation deepened the tragedy rather than resolving it. Even more troubling were later findings regarding the Indian prisoners aboard the Japanese transport. Research conducted by Indian historian Dr. Pratap Singh revealed that soldiers from the 2nd Battalion of the 16th Punjab Regiment had attempted to alert Wahoo during the attack. Several prisoners were fluent in English and shouted desperately to identify themselves as Allied troops. The chaos of battle, distance, gunfire, smoke, made their efforts futile. Their voices were never heard. When confronted decades later with evidence that the transport ships carrying prisoners had not been properly marked, the Japanese government declined to issue a formal apology. In 2007, official spokesperson Hiroshi Yamamoto offered only a general statement acknowledging the tragedy of war and reiterating that Japan had addressed its wartime responsibilities through established channels. The Indian government, for its part, has never released an official statement regarding the deaths of these soldiers. As a result, Morton's legacy remains deeply conflicted. Within the United States Navy, he is still regarded as one of the most formidable submarine commanders in its history. His name was given to the destroyer USS Morton DD-948, which entered service in 1959 and remained active until 1990. At the U.S. Naval Academy, Morton Hall continues to host visiting officials, and his tactical innovations are examined at the Naval War College as case studies in transformative military thinking. Yet the shadow of Wahoo Maru endures. In 2003, when the Navy proposed naming a new attack submarine in Morton's honor, opposition emerged swiftly. Human rights advocates and Indian American organizations argued that such recognition ignored the moral cost of his actions. Faced with mounting pressure, the Navy quietly withdrew the proposal. Morton's story, like the war itself, resists simple judgment. He was both an architect of victory and a figure tied to irreversible tragedy, remembered simultaneously as a pioneer of modern submarine warfare and a commander whose decisions continue to trouble the historical record. The submarine ultimately received the name USS Texas, a decision that quietly closed one chapter of a controversy that refused to fade with time. Decades after the Second World War, the conduct of Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton continued to provoke debate, revealing how unresolved the moral questions of total war remained even 60 years later. Among those most deeply affected was George Grider, an officer who had served closely with Morton and understood his personality better than almost anyone. In the final years of his life, Grider struggled openly with how history should remember his former commander. Speaking in a 1988 interview, only 3 years before his death, he offered a reflection filled with both admiration and regret. Morton, he said, was unmatched in courage and effectiveness, arguably the finest submarine commander of the conflict. Yet Grider could not escape the memory of one particular moment at sea, a moment that, in his words, marked a transformation. The crew, he felt, had crossed a moral boundary and become something they were never meant to be. Not all of Morton's contemporaries shared that unease. Richard O'Kane, who absorbed Morton's aggressive philosophy and went on to become the most successful American submarine commander of the war, remained steadfast in his defense. In his final public interview in 1993, O'Kane rejected the idea that Morton's actions should be judged by peacetime standards. War, he argued, was governed by necessity rather than idealized rules. Japan had initiated the conflict through surprise attack and had committed widespread atrocities against prisoners of war. Within that brutal context, O'Kane believed Morton acted as he thought required to achieve victory.
To condemn him later, he insisted, was to misunderstand the realities of the era. While Morton's decision stood out even within the U.S. submarine service, it did not occur in isolation. It was part of a wider descent into increasingly ruthless methods throughout the Pacific theater. American submariners operated under directives that would have been unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. At the same time, Japanese naval forces committed acts of violence that far exceeded anything attributed to Morton. As the conflict intensified, both sides steadily abandoned earlier norms of naval conduct, replacing them with strategies aimed at total destruction of the enemy. By the conclusion of the war, the American submarine force had inflicted staggering damage. U.S. submarines sent 1,314 Japanese ships to the bottom, amounting to roughly 5.3 million tons of shipping, more than half of all Japanese maritime losses. This achievement came at extraordinary cost. Submariners suffered the highest fatality rate of any branch of the American armed forces. Approximately 22% were killed in action. 52 submarines were lost, along with about 3,500 men. Although submariners made up only 2% of total Navy personnel, they were responsible for 55% of Japan's shipping losses. These results carried a heavy moral burden. Beyond the incident associated with Morton, American submarines frequently chose not to assist enemy survivors in the water, reasoning that rescue efforts endangered their own missions and crews. Vessels marked as hospital ships were sometimes attacked when suspected of transporting troops or supplies. Naval mines were laid in coastal waters used not only for military traffic, but also for fishing boats and civilian ferries. In the logic of total war, the principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants steadily eroded. Japanese submarine operations were conducted with even fewer restraints. Documented cases describe attacks on survivors and other violations of accepted norms. Japanese planners also explored methods of biological warfare, including attempts, ultimately unsuccessful, to strike the American mainland. Among the most chilling proposals was a plan to assault the Panama Canal using aircraft intended to disperse plague-infected fleas, a scheme that never advanced beyond the planning stage. Seen against this backdrop of virtually unrestricted warfare, Morton's actions appear less anomalous, though no less disturbing. Modern scholars of military ethics remain divided when assessing his legacy. The case is now studied at the U.S. Naval War College, where it is presented to officers as a practical ethical dilemma rather than a settled judgment. Students are asked to consider Morton's precise circumstances. Enemy soldiers adrift in lifeboats, moving toward nearby shorelines. Reactions to the scenario differ sharply, often influenced by an officer's combat experience and cultural perspective.
Captain James Campbell, who teaches ethics at Annapolis, describes Morton as a symbol of an enduring conflict between effectiveness and moral responsibility. According to Campbell, Morton excelled at destroying enemy shipping and killing adversaries, but success divorced from ethical restraint risks descending into savagery. The purpose of studying Morton, he explains, is not to excuse or condemn him outright, but to understand where moral boundaries lie and why they are essential. Since 1943, the legal framework governing warfare at sea has changed substantially. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 clearly established protections for shipwrecked survivors, regardless of whether they are combatants. The additional protocols adopted in 1977 reinforced these principles. Nevertheless, enforcing such laws remains difficult, particularly in modern conflicts involving irregular forces that do not recognize international norms. Today's submarine commanders face dilemmas that echo those of the past, though shaped by new technologies and political realities. Should a submarine strike a vessel believed to be transporting terrorists if civilians may also be aboard? How much uncertainty is acceptable before lethal force is used? The Morton episode provides no simple guidance. Instead, it stands as a cautionary example of how decisions made under extreme pressure can define a commander's reputation long after the war itself has ended. Forrest Sterling, a member of Wahoo's crew who witnessed the lifeboat attack firsthand, carried those memories with him until his death in 2002. His long life served as a quiet reminder that the consequences of wartime choices often endure far beyond the moment of action, living on in memory, history, and unresolved moral debate. In his 1999 memoir, Wake of the Wahoo, Sterling offered what is widely regarded as the most unflinching personal reflection on one of the darkest episodes in American submarine warfare during the Second World War. Looking back across 6 decades, he did not attempt to soften the memory or distance himself from it. At the time, Sterling was only 21. He was serving as a lookout when American gunfire was directed at enemy survivors adrift in lifeboats. He recalled witnessing one man attempt to surrender, raising a white cloth in a desperate plea. That single image, he wrote, never left him. It followed him throughout his life.
Sterling described Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton as an exceptional leader, charismatic, decisive, and responsible for shaping USS Wahoo into one of the most aggressive and effective submarines operating in the Pacific theater. Yet, Sterling made a sharp distinction between Morton's skill as a commander and the moral weight of what occurred that day. He stated plainly that the attack on the lifeboats was wrong and that everyone involved understood this even as it was happening. The crew followed orders because naval discipline demanded it and because they trusted their captain completely. When asked years later whether he harbored hatred toward Morton for placing him in that situation, Sterling answered no. In his view, Morton was a product of a system and a conflict that rewarded lethal efficiency above all else. His objective was victory, and he pursued it by eliminating every enemy he encountered. Sterling argued that the deeper injustice was not the individual act, but the war itself. War, he believed, has the power to transform honorable men into agents of death and then elevate them as heroes for doing so. Morton was praised, decorated, and celebrated for sinking ships and sending thousands to their deaths. From that perspective, Sterling questioned why anyone should have been shocked when the same logic extended to defenseless men floating in the sea. He went further, asserting that submarine warfare had always involved the killing of those who could not fight back. Every merchant vessel destroyed carried sailors with no realistic means of escape. The only difference, he noted, was distance. Torpedoes allowed crews to avoid witnessing the final moments of their victims. On January 26, 1943, that distance disappeared. The men aboard Wahoo were forced to confront the human reality of what their weapons did. They saw faces, they heard voices, they participated directly. Post-war investigations later reconstructed the full scope of the tragedy. The Japanese transport Buyo Maru carried a total of 1,126 people. Among them were 360 Japanese soldiers from the 26th Field Ordnance Depot and approximately 760 Indian personnel from the 2nd Battalion of the 16th Punjab Regiment serving under British command. The initial torpedo attack killed 195 Indian troops and 87 Japanese soldiers. Subsequent gunfire directed at lifeboats resulted in an additional 282 deaths. Japanese rescue vessels eventually recovered 844 survivors from the water. During Wahoo's third patrol, the submarine reported 8 enemy ships destroyed. Later analysis confirmed only 4 sinkings. Claimed tonnage of 32,000 tons was revised downward to an actual total of roughly 16,000 tons. Records indicate that during the lifeboat engagement, the crew expended approximately 20 rounds from the 4-inch deck gun, around 2,000 shells from the 20mm cannon, and an uncounted number of machine gun rounds. The engagement lasted between 30 and 45 minutes. At the time, the submarine was only 3 to 5 miles from land.
Morton commanded Wahoo on 5 patrols, from the 3rd through the 7th. Over that period, the submarine was credited with sinking 19 confirmed enemy vessels, totaling about 55,000 tons. The crew spent 138 days at sea under his command. 79 sailors were lost during those patrols, all of them on Wahoo's final mission, from which the submarine never returned. The wreck of USS Wahoo now rests in international waters between Japan and Russia. It remains undisturbed, a steel grave for the 79 Americans who died with their commander. International agreements classify the site as a protected war grave, and no recovery efforts have been undertaken. In 2008, a joint American-Japanese expedition visited the location and placed memorial plaques on the seafloor. The American marker honors the crew of Wahoo with the words, "To the brave men of USS Wahoo, still on patrol." The Japanese plaque commemorates all those who perished in the surrounding seas. Neither memorial makes any reference to the Indian soldiers who lost their lives on January 26, 1943. They were men swept into a clash of global powers, participants in a conflict they neither designed nor controlled. When Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton was lost with his submarine, his wife Harriet was left to live with the weight of that history alone. She never remarried and survived until 1979. Throughout her life, she carefully preserved the personal correspondence Morton had sent her during the war, yet she never revealed what those letters contained or spoke publicly about them. After Harriet's death, the letters were entrusted to the U.S. Naval Historical Center under strict conditions. They were to remain unopened until the year 2043, marking 100 years since Morton's death. As a result, whatever reflections, doubts, or justifications Morton may have shared privately with his wife remain sealed away, inaccessible to historians and the public alike. The final living link to the USS Wahoo's earliest patrols disappeared in 2019. Andrew Lennox, a motor machinist's mate who had served aboard the submarine before its most infamous mission, died at the age of 98. Lennox had been reassigned only weeks before the events surrounding the Wahoo Maru tragedy. In what would become his last recorded interview, he was asked to describe Morton. His response was both reverent and unsettling. He called Morton the greatest submarine commander he had ever known, while also labeling him the most frightening individual he had encountered. Lennox added that he was grateful not to have been present on Wahoo's 3rd patrol, admitting he doubted he could have reconciled himself with what took place there. The attack carried out by USS Wahoo against survivors in lifeboats on January 26, 1943, compels historians to examine some of the most troubling consequences of modern warfare. The incident challenges comforting assumptions about professionalism, discipline, and moral restraint within elite military forces. Morton's decision did not arise from personal malice or bloodlust. Instead, it followed a grim internal logic born from the doctrine of total war. If the complete destruction of the enemy is the objective, then mercy becomes a liability rather than a virtue. In the waters north of New Guinea, Morton made a choice that placed him beyond the boundaries set by international conventions, centuries-old maritime customs, and fundamental ethical principles. He believed that eliminating enemy personnel, even when they were defenseless and no longer posed an immediate threat, was a necessary act to protect future American lives. That reasoning, however, carried catastrophic consequences. Alongside Japanese soldiers, 195 Indian prisoners of war perished in the attack, their deaths serving as a lasting indictment of how easily moral reasoning can be distorted under the pressure of survival. There is no denying that Morton's influence on American submarine operations was profound. The tactics he championed reshaped undersea warfare in the Pacific. The force he helped mold went on to devastate Japan's shipping network, playing a crucial role in isolating the island nation and hastening Allied victory. For many within the Navy, Morton became a symbol of boldness, innovation, and uncompromising aggression. Yet, his reputation can never be separated from the events of that single half hour at sea. Those 30 to 45 minutes cast a permanent shadow over his achievements, illustrating how quickly wartime necessity can override the moral standards that societies claim to uphold in peace. The Wahoo incident revealed that American forces were capable of the same brutality they attributed to their enemies, particularly when the boundaries of acceptable conduct were blurred by desperation and fear. Both Allied sailors and Japanese servicemen had assumed that American submarines would not fire upon lifeboats carrying survivors. That assumption died alongside the men in the water. The episode underscored a broader truth. In total war, moral superiority is fragile, and no participant emerges untouched. Survival-driven logic transforms all sides, often in ways they would later struggle to justify or condemn. Morton demonstrated that U.S. submariners could match any force in history for ruthlessness and resolve. Whether such conduct was unavoidable, defensible, or a war crime is a debate that refuses to fade with time. Each generation revisits the question, shaped by its own values and distance from the violence itself. Today, USS Wahoo lies on the seabed of the La Perouse Strait, resting at a depth of 213 feet. Entombed within the wreck are the remains of 79 American sailors who followed their commander into the most morally ambiguous depths of the Second World War, leaving behind a legacy that continues to challenge how history judges courage, obedience, and responsibility in war. They continue their endless watch, standing as a silent testament to a recurring truth of conflict. The deepest loss inflicted by war is often the erosion of our moral core. Once certain boundaries are breached, history shows that they cannot simply be restored. On that day in January, 282 lives were extinguished at sea. Japanese servicemen, Indian captives, individuals who carried personal histories, loved ones, and unrealized plans. Their deaths were not only the result of combat, but of a ruthless chain of reasoning that war can generate when efficiency and victory are allowed to outweigh human value. This moment encapsulates the enduring shadow of Morton's actions. His legacy cannot be measured solely by the number of vessels destroyed or the operational methods he refined beneath the surface of the ocean. More enduring than those achievements is the moral dilemma his conduct leaves behind. It forces later generations to confront an uncomfortable question. How far are we prepared to go in pursuit of triumph, and at what point does the method of achieving success negate the very principles it is meant to safeguard? In this sense, the episode is not confined to a single battle or commander. It becomes a case study in how warfare, when pushed to its logical extreme, can blur the line between strategic necessity and irreversible ethical loss.